The Wyoming sky burned with colors of dying daylight as Victoria Caldwell stumbled down the final dusty slope toward Promise Creek. Her arms ached from carrying 6-month-old Emily, wrapped in a threadbare blanket despite the summer heat of 1878. Victoria's lips were cracked from thirst, her cotton dress stained with 3 days of desperate travel. But she refused to surrender to exhaustion, not when her baby's fevered whimpers grew weaker by the hour. "Just a little further, sweet girl," Victoria whispered, pressing chapped lips to her daughter's burning forehead. The infant's skin felt like hot coals against her mouth. "We're almost there now." Promise Creek wasn't much a scattered collection of wooden buildings along the stagecoach route, a place most travelers passed through without a second glance. But to Victoria, those weathered structures represented her only hope. Since Emily's fever had started 3 nights ago, Victoria had watched helplessly as her daughter's condition deteriorated. The nearest doctor was in Promise Creek, 15 miles from the isolated cabin Victoria had called home since her husband's death last winter. As the town's single street came into view, Victoria summoned her last reserves of strength. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle with each step. Emily's soft moans had quieted to an eerie silence that terrified Victoria more than her cries ever had. "Help," she called, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. Victoria cleared her throat and tried again. "Please, someone help us." A few townsfolk turned to stare, but none approached. Victoria didn't blame them. A disheveled woman carrying a sick baby likely meant trouble, and trouble was something folks in these parts generally avoided. The sign for doctor. Patterson's office appeared at the far end of the street, and Victoria fixed her gaze on it like a drowning person spotting a distant shore. Just 50 more yards. Her vision blurred, dark spots dancing before her eyes as she forced one foot in front of the other. "Madam, you all right there?" Victoria turned toward the deep voice, blinking to clear her vision. A tall man stood beside a hitching post, one hand on the reins of a chestnut mare. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat brim, but she could make out a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. The silver star pinned to his vest caught the fading sunlight. "My baby," Victoria managed, her voice cracking. "She's burning with fever. I need Dr. Patterson." The man stepped closer, concern etching his weathered features. He couldn't have been more than 30, with piercing blue eyes that assessed the situation quickly. "Doc Patterson passed on last month," he said quietly. "Influenza took him and a dozen others." Victoria's knees finally gave way. She would have fallen if the man hadn't moved with surprising speed to catch her elbow, steadying her. Emily made a small, plaintive sound as Victoria clutched her tighter. "No," Victoria whispered. "No, he can't be gone. My baby needs a doctor." The man's expression softened as he looked at Emily's flushed face. "I'm Daniel McAllister, county sheriff here in Promise Creek. We don't have a doctor anymore, but there's a good one in Fort Laramie. We'll find a doctor together." Victoria searched his face for any sign of deception or false hope. All she found was steady determination. "I can't make it to Fort Laramie," she admitted. "We've been traveling for days." Sheriff McAllister nodded toward the nearby building. "My office is right there." "You can rest while I ready my wagon. What's your name, madam?" Victoria Caldwell. "This is Emily." "How old is she?" 6 months. The sheriff leaned closer to examine Emily, his brow furrowed with concern. "How long has she had the fever?" 3 days now. It started with a cough and then. Victoria trailed off, exhaustion and fear overwhelming her. "Let's get you both inside," Daniel said, gently guiding her toward his office. "Fort Laramie's a day's ride, but I know some shortcuts. We'll be there by morning." Victoria allowed herself to be led across the dusty street, conscious of the curious stares from the few townsfolk still about their business at this hour. The sheriff's office was a simple wooden structure with a small jail cell in the back, but it was clean and orderly. A desk occupied one corner, a pot-bellied stove another, and a narrow cot stood against the wall. "Sit here," Daniel directed, clearing papers from a chair. "I'll fetch some water." Victoria sank gratefully onto the chair, adjusting Emily in her arms. The baby's breathing was shallow, her tiny body radiating heat. Victoria pressed her lips to Emily's forehead, sending up a silent prayer. Daniel returned moments later with a cup of water and a damp cloth. "For you," he said, offering the cup, "and this might help cool her a bit." Victoria took both with murmured thanks, sipping the water before gently wiping Emily's flushed face with the cool cloth. The baby stirred slightly, a good sign when Victoria had feared she'd become too weak to respond. "I've got a wagon out back," Daniel said, buckling on his gun belt. "It's not fancy, but there's room enough for you to lie down with the little one. I'll grab some blankets and supplies." While he moved about gathering what they'd need, Victoria studied Sheriff McAllister. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean build of a man who worked hard for his living. His movements were efficient, purposeful. She wondered briefly how a man with such gentle eyes had ended up wearing a lawman's badge in a rough place like Promise Creek. "You're traveling alone?" he asked, packing jerky and hardtack into a satchel. "Yes, my husband Thomas died last winter, hunting accident." Victoria's voice remained steady through long practice. "We have had a homestead about 15 miles northeast of here." Daniel paused in his preparations. "Caldwell." "Thomas Caldwell, who came out from Pennsylvania 2 years back," Victoria nodded, surprised. "You knew him. Met him once or twice when he'd come to town for supplies. Good man. I was sorry to hear about the accident." Daniel's expression grew solemn. "It can't have been easy, out there alone with a baby." "We managed," Victoria said simply, though managing hardly described the brutal months of isolation, the back-breaking work of maintaining a homestead alone, the nights spent fighting despair and loneliness. Daniel seemed to hear what she didn't say. He nodded once, respect in his eyes. "I'll just get the wagon ready. Won't be but a minute." True to his word, Daniel returned shortly to escort Victoria and Emily to a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 strong horses. He'd arranged blankets in the back to make a comfortable bed. "The road's rough in places," he warned, helping Victoria climb into the wagon bed, "but this will be easier on the little one than horseback." Victoria settled herself against the blankets, cradling Emily close. Daniel handed her a canteen of fresh water and checked that the cloth coverings he'd rigged would shield them from sun and dust. "Fort Laramie's about 60 miles. We'll stop to rest the horses, but I aim to get there as quick as we can," he said, climbing onto the driver's seat. With a light slap of the reins, he set the horses in motion. The wagon lurched forward and Victoria braced herself against the side. Emily whimpered at the movement, her first sound in hours. Victoria murmured soothing nonsense, stroking the baby's damp curls. As they rattled past the last buildings of Promise Creek, Victoria felt a strange mix of fear and hope. She was putting her daughter's life in the hands of this stranger, this sheriff, with kind eyes and a determined set to his jaw. She had no choice but to trust him. The sunset painted the vast Wyoming landscape in gold and crimson as they headed east toward Fort Laramie, the army post that served as the region's center of civilization. Victoria gazed at the back of Daniel McAllister's broad shoulders, silhouetted against the darkening sky, and prayed she'd made the right decision. Daniel kept the horses at a steady pace, finding the smoothest path along the rutted trail. Occasionally, he'd glance back to check on his passengers, his expression revealing genuine concern. "How's she doing?" he called over his shoulder after they'd been traveling for about an hour. Victoria dabbed the damp cloth against Emily's forehead. "The same." "But she's taking water, which is good." Daniel nodded. "There's a creek about 5 miles ahead. We'll stop there, rest the horses." As darkness fell, Victoria found herself oddly comforted by the steady rhythm of hooves and wheels, the quiet strength of the man guiding them through the night. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Every time Emily stirred or made the slightest sound, Victoria was instantly alert. "You should try to rest, Mrs. Caldwell," Daniel said softly, noticing her vigilance. "I'll wake you if anything changes." "Victoria," she corrected, "and I can't sleep." "Not while she's like this." Daniel's expression was understanding. "You've come a long way alone. That takes courage, not courage, desperation." Victoria adjusted Emily's blanket. "When you have a child, you do what needs doing." Still, Daniel insisted, 15 miles on foot with a sick baby, that's no small thing. Victoria didn't respond. What choice had she had? After Emily's fever had persisted for a day with no sign of breaking, she'd known she couldn't wait any longer. Their nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, an elderly couple unlikely to have been much help. The wagon was broken, the only horse had gone lame 2 weeks earlier. Walking to town had been the only option. They reached the creek as the moon rose, bathing the landscape in silver light. Daniel brought the wagon to a halt in a small clearing near the water. He helped Victoria down, then tended to the horses while she walked slowly around the clearing, still carrying Emily. The movement seemed to soothe the baby, who had grown restless as the fever continued to burn through her tiny body. "Let me take her for a spell," Daniel offered when he'd finished with the horses. "You look dead on your feet," Victoria hesitated. She never allowed others to hold Emily, not since Thomas died, but her arms ached fiercely and she was light-headed with fatigue. "I've got nieces and nephews," Daniel added, sensing her reluctance. "I won't drop her." After another moment's hesitation, Victoria carefully transferred her daughter to the sheriff's arms. Daniel cradled Emily with surprising gentleness, supporting her head with practiced ease. The baby looked even smaller against his broad chest. "There now, little miss," he murmured to Emily, beginning to pace slowly around the clearing. "You're quite the fighter, aren't you?" Victoria sank onto a fallen log, flexing her cramped fingers. The night was cool but not cold, the air sweet with the scent of sage and wildflowers. She watched as Daniel walked with Emily, talking to her in a low, soothing voice. Something tight within Victoria's chest eased slightly at the sight. "She likes movement," Victoria said after a while. "Even as a newborn, she'd only settle when I walked with her." Daniel smiled. "My sister's youngest was the same way, near wore a path in their floorboards those first months." "You have family nearby?" Victoria asked, accepting the canteen he passed her. Daniel's smile faded slightly. "Back east in Ohio, haven't seen them in 3 years. What brought you out here?" He was quiet for a moment, his expression distant. "The war left a lot of ghosts, needed open spaces to outrun them." Victoria nodded, understanding more than she could say. Though too young to have fought, Thomas had lost 2 brothers in the war. Those ghosts had driven him west as surely as if they'd been chasing him with whips. "And the badge?" she asked, nodding toward the silver star still pinned to his vest. Daniel glanced down, as if surprised to find it there. "Fell into it, I suppose. Town needed someone, and I've always had a knack for settling troubles without too much bloodshed. Rare quality out here." Emily began to fuss, and Daniel rocked her gently until she quieted. "She's still burning up," he observed with concern. Victoria stood, reaching for her daughter. "I should try to get more water into her." They worked together to coax Emily to take small sips from a spoon. The baby resisted at first, turning her head away, but eventually accepted enough to ease Victoria's immediate fears of dehydration. "We should get moving again," Daniel said once they'd tended to Emily. "I know a shortcut through the hills that'll save us a few hours." They settled back into the wagon, but this time Daniel had arranged the blankets differently, creating a more secure nest that allowed Victoria to half recline while still holding Emily safely. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Victoria's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. As they continued their journey through the night, Daniel began to talk, perhaps sensing that conversation would help keep Victoria awake and distracted from her fears. "How long were you and your husband on that homestead?" he asked. "Almost 2 years," Victoria replied. "Thomas had dreams of building a cattle ranch. We started small, too small, really, but he was convinced we'd make it work." "And after he passed?" Daniel's question was gentle. Victoria gazed up at the star-filled sky. "I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. My parents died years ago. I have a sister in St. Louis, but we haven't spoken since I married Thomas. She didn't approve of him taking me out west. Homesteading's hard enough for a family," Daniel said. "For a woman alone with a baby." "We were managing," Victoria insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Truth was, the past 6 months had been a slow-motion slide toward disaster. The garden had failed, the cow had died, and without Thomas's hunting, food had grown scarce. If not for Emily's illness forcing her hand, pride might have kept her on that failing homestead until they both starved. Daniel seemed to read between the lines. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to change course. His words struck Victoria with unexpected force. She'd seen staying on the homestead as honoring Thomas's memory, his dream. But what good was loyalty to the dead if it endangered the living? Emily stirred in her arms, whimpering softly. Victoria pressed her lips to the baby's forehead and found it still burning hot. Fear clutched at her heart anew. How much farther? She asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. We'll reach Fort Laramie by dawn if we keep this pace, Daniel assured her. The doctor there is good army trained. He's seen it all, Victoria nodded, clinging to his confidence. They traveled in silence for a time, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional creak of wagon wheels. The moon had begun its descent toward the western horizon when Emily's breathing suddenly changed, becoming more labored. Daniel, Victoria called, panic rising in her throat. Something's wrong. Daniel immediately brought the wagon to a halt and climbed into the back. In the moonlight, they could see Emily's chest rising and falling rapidly, her tiny face contorted in distress. She can't breathe, Victoria gasped, terror clawing at her. She can't breathe. Daniel's calm voice cut through her panic. She's struggling, but air is getting through. I've seen this before. My nephew had something similar. He took Emily carefully from Victoria's arms. Hold the lantern closer, he instructed, then positioned the baby face down across his forearm, her head lower than her chest. With his other hand, he delivered 3 firm but gentle pats between her shoulder blades. Emily gave a small cough, then another, stronger one. On the 3rd pat, she coughed harshly and a small amount of phlegm came up. Daniel quickly turned her over, wiping her mouth with a clean cloth. Emily drew in a rattling breath, then another. Her breathing remained labored but was noticeably easier. The fever's causing congestion in her chest, Daniel explained, handing the baby back to Victoria. Keeping her upright might help, and the padding loosens what's built up. How did you know to do that? Victoria asked, grateful tears streaming down her face as she cradled Emily close. My sister's boy had lung fever 2 winters back. Army doctor at Fort Kearney showed us how to help him breathe. Daniel's expression grew serious. But Victoria, she needs real medical help soon. That's just a temporary measure. Victoria nodded, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. Then let's keep going. Daniel squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before returning to the driver's seat. As they set off again, Victoria kept Emily propped against her chest, occasionally patting her back as Daniel had demonstrated whenever the baby's breathing grew more labored. The stars began to fade from the eastern sky as they pressed on. Victoria fought against exhaustion, singing softly to Emily, counting her breaths, doing anything to stay awake and alert to changes in her daughter's condition. Tell me about her, Daniel said as the first hint of dawn lightened the horizon. Emily, what kind of baby is she when she's not sick? Victoria's lips curved into a small smile despite her worry. Determined, strong-willed. She started trying to crawl at 4 months too early, really because she wanted to reach a wooden spoon I was using. Sounds like she takes after her mother, Daniel remarked. Victoria gave a soft laugh. Thomas said the same thing. She has his eyes, though, clear blue like a summer sky. Hard to tell in this light, but I think she might have your smile. You haven't seen me smile much, Victoria pointed out. Enough to notice, Daniel replied quietly. Victoria felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the approaching sunrise. It had been so long since anyone had really seen her not as Thomas's widow or Emily's mother, but as herself. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like. As dawn broke fully across the eastern plains, Fort Laramie appeared in the distance, a collection of white buildings surrounding a parade ground, with the stars and stripes flying above. The sight filled Victoria with renewed hope. Almost there, Daniel said, urging the tired horses to a final effort. They approached the fort's main gate as the morning bugle sounded, announcing the changing of the guard. Daniel called out a greeting to the sentries, who recognized him and waved them through without question. Advantages of being the law in these parts, he explained to Victoria's questioning look. Most of these boys know me. I've helped the army track down deserters a time or two. He drove directly to a whitewashed building near the center of the fort. A sign identified it as the infirmary. Before Daniel had even fully stopped the wagon, a man in shirt sleeves emerged, a stethoscope hanging around his neck. "McAllister," the man greeted, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Dr. Warren," Daniel replied, jumping down from the wagon. "We've got a sick baby that needs your attention. Fever, labored breathing, been going on for days now." Dr. Warren's demeanor immediately shifted to professional concern. He approached the wagon as Daniel helped Victoria down, Emily still clutched to her chest. "Madam," the doctor said, reaching for the baby. "Let me see her." Victoria hesitated only briefly before surrendering her daughter to the doctor's experienced hands. Dr. Warren examined Emily quickly but thoroughly, feeling her forehead, listening to her chest, checking her eyes and throat. "Let's get her inside," he said, his voice calm but carrying an urgency that increased Victoria's anxiety. "How long has she had the fever?" "4 days now," Victoria answered, following him into the infirmary with Daniel close behind her. "It started with a cough." The infirmary was a long room with a row of beds along each wall. Most were empty, though 2 held sleeping soldiers. Dr. Warren led them to a small examination room off to the side, where he laid Emily on a clean white sheet. "She's severely dehydrated and there's significant congestion in her lungs," Dr. Warren diagnosed, his hands moving efficiently as he continued his examination. "Likely pneumonia, though I want to rule out diphtheria." Victoria's knees weakened at the grave diagnosis, and she might have fallen if Daniel hadn't steadied her with a supportive arm. "Can you help her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Warren's expression was serious but not without hope. "We'll do everything we can, Mrs. Caldwell, Victoria Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell, I need to act quickly. I'll need to draw some fluid from her chest to help her breathe, and we must get her fever down and fluids into her." Victoria nodded, trying to process his words through her exhaustion and fear. "The procedure isn't pleasant to watch," Dr. Warren continued gently. "Perhaps Sheriff McAllister could take you to get some food and rest while I work." "No," Victoria said firmly. "I'm staying with my daughter." Dr. Warren assessed her determined expression and nodded. "Very well. Sheriff, there's coffee in the pot in the main ward. Would you fetch Mrs. Caldwell a cup? She looks about ready to collapse." As Daniel left to get the coffee, Dr. Warren turned to Victoria with compassionate eyes. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Caldwell. Your daughter is very ill. But she's made it this far, which tells me she's a fighter, and she's young children can recover from things that would kill a grown man." Victoria swallowed hard. "Just tell me what to do." Over the next few hours, Victoria assisted Dr. Warren as he worked to save Emily's life. She held her daughter during the frightening procedure to drain fluid from the baby's lungs, soothed her through the application of mustard plasters to her chest, and helped administer small amounts of medicine and water. Through it all, Daniel remained nearby, bringing coffee and food that Victoria barely touched, offering quiet support that became her anchor in the storm of fear. By midday, Dr. Warren had done all he could. Emily lay in a small crib, her breathing still labored but less desperate. Her fever remained high but no longer at the dangerous levels of the early morning. "Now we wait," Dr. Warren said, washing his hands in a basin. "The next 24 hours will tell. If the fever breaks by this time tomorrow, I believe she'll recover fully. And if it doesn't?" Victoria asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. The doctor's expression was grave. "Let's focus on getting through tonight, Mrs. Caldwell." Victoria nodded, taking her place in a chair beside Emily's crib. She was vaguely aware of Dr. Warren and Daniel speaking quietly by the door, but couldn't summon the energy to listen to their conversation. Daniel approached her after the doctor left. "Dr. Warren has arranged a cot for you in here," he said, indicating a narrow bed that had been set up on the other side of Emily's crib. "He says you should try to rest while Emily sleeps. He'll check on her regularly." "I can't sleep," Victoria protested weakly, though her body screamed for rest. You've been awake for nearly 2 days, Daniel pointed out gently. You need to keep up your strength for when she wakes. Victoria knew he was right, but the thought of sleeping while Emily's life hung in the balance seemed impossible. Yet when Daniel guided her to the cot, her body betrayed her. The moment she lay down, exhaustion overwhelmed her, and despite her determination to stay awake, she fell into a deep sleep. She woke disoriented, the room dim with evening shadows. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why. Then she heard a soft voice singing a familiar lullaby, and everything rushed back. Victoria sat up quickly. Daniel was sitting in the chair she had vacated, singing quietly to Emily while bathing her forehead with a cool cloth. The baby was awake, her eyes following Daniel's movements with weary interest. "Emily," Victoria gasped, hurrying to the crib. Daniel looked up with a tired smile. "She woke about an hour ago. Doctor's been in to check her fevers down a bit." Victoria reached into the crib to touch her daughter's cheek. It was still warm but noticeably cooler than before. Emily turned toward her mother's touch, making a small sound of recognition. "You should have woken me," Victoria said, though she couldn't summon any real reproach. The sight of Emily awake and responsive filled her with overwhelming relief. "You needed the rest," Daniel replied simply. "Besides, the little miss and I have been getting acquainted." As if to confirm his words, Emily's hand curled around Daniel's finger when he placed it near her. The gesture, so small yet so full of life, brought tears to Victoria's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Daniel, "for everything. We wouldn't have made it without you." Daniel's expression softened. "You'd have found a way. You strike me as a woman who doesn't give up easily. Doctor." Warren entered before Victoria could respond. He examined Emily thoroughly, his expression growing more optimistic as he worked. "Her fever's dropped 2 degrees, he announced. "Breathing's easier too. She's responding well to the treatment. So she'll recover." Victoria asked, hardly daring to hope. "If she continues improving at this rate, I believe so. She's not out of danger, yet the fever needs to break completely, but she's heading in the right direction." The doctor smiled kindly at Victoria. "Your daughter is quite remarkable, Mrs. Caldwell. Many babies wouldn't have survived what she's been through." "She's a fighter," Daniel said, echoing Victoria's earlier words. "Indeed." Dr. Warren packed up his instruments. "Continue with the cool compresses and give her the medicine every 4 hours. Try to get her to take more fluids." "I'll check back before midnight." After the doctor left, Victoria took Daniel's place in the chair beside Emily's crib. The baby had drifted back to sleep, her breathing still labored but noticeably improved. "You should get some rest too," Victoria told Daniel, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. "You've been awake as long as I have." Daniel shook his head. "I'll be fine. I've gone longer without sleep." "During the war?" Victoria asked softly. Daniel's expression grew distant. "Yes." "And after, when the nightmares were at their worst?" Victoria didn't press for details. She understood that some wounds were too deep to expose to casual conversation. Instead, she asked, "Will you tell me about your family, your sister and her children?" The tactic worked. Daniel's expression lightened as he spoke of his older sister, Mary, and her 5 children. He described their farm in Ohio, the apple orchards his brother-in-law tended, the letters he received every month filled with news of home. As he talked, Victoria sensed the deep loneliness that echoed her own, the isolation of a life lived apart from those who knew you best. "Why did you stay out west?" she asked when he paused. "After the war, I mean, why not go back to them?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "At first I wasn't fit for civilized company," he finally said. "The war changes a man. I didn't want to bring those changes home to Mary's children." And later, he shrugged. "Later, it was easier to keep moving forward than to go back. I found I had a knack for keeping the peace." "Towns out here need good lawmen." "Promise Creek seems lucky to have you," Victoria observed. A rueful smile crossed Daniel's face. "Not everyone would agree. Being sheriff means making enemies as often as friends." Their conversation continued as night fell fully. A nurse brought them a simple supper, which they ate while taking turns cooling Emily's forehead. The baby woke periodically, taking small amounts of water and medicine before drifting back to sleep. Dr. Warren returned as promised. his examination confirming that Emily continued to improve. "Keep doing what you're doing," he advised. "If all goes well, her fever should break by morning." Victoria maintained her vigil throughout the night, dozing occasionally in the chair. Daniel refused to leave, though she urged him several times to find a proper bed. He eventually compromised by stretching out on the floor, using his folded jacket as a pillow. Shortly before dawn, Victoria woke from a light doze to find Emily stirring restlessly in her crib. Alarmed, she placed a hand on her daughter's forehead and found it slick with perspiration but cooler to the touch. "Daniel," she called softly, not wanting to wake him if he was deeply asleep. He was on his feet instantly, crossing to the crib. "What is it?" "I think her fever might be breaking," Victoria said, hope rising in her chest. "She's sweating and her skin feels cooler." Daniel touched Emily's cheek gently. "You're right. Should I get the doctor? Let me check her properly first." Victoria carefully unwrapped Emily from her light blanket. The baby's nightgown was damp with sweat, her curls plastered to her forehead. But her breathing was easier than it had been since they arrived, and when Victoria stroked her cheek, Emily turned toward the touch, her eyes opening drowsily. "Hello, my sweet girl," Victoria whispered, tears of relief filling her eyes. Emily's lips curved in a tiny smile of recognition, the first since falling ill. It was that small gesture, more than anything else, that told Victoria her daughter would recover. "Doctor." Warren, summoned by a nurse who had noticed the activity, confirmed Victoria's assessment. "The fever's breaking," he said after examining Emily. "Her lungs sound clearer too. I believe the worst has passed." The words released something tight and fearful that had been coiled inside Victoria since Emily's first cough 4 days earlier. She sank into the chair beside the crib, overcome with exhaustion and relief. Daniel's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a warm, steadying presence. When she looked up at him, the genuine joy in his eyes mirrored her own. "She's going to be all right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did it, Victoria. We did it," she corrected softly. "I wouldn't have made it here without you." As morning light filtered through the infirmary windows, Victoria allowed herself for the first time to think beyond the immediate crisis. Emily would recover, but what then? The failing homestead waited, a burden she could no longer pretend to manage. Her meager savings wouldn't last long. The future stretched before her, uncertain and daunting. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts. "One step at a time," he advised gently. "For today, just be grateful she's on the mend." Victoria nodded, taking his wisdom to heart. Today was for gratitude, for holding her recovering daughter close, for thanking this unexpected ally who had become something more than a stranger in the space of a desperate journey. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they would face them together. Emily's recovery, while steady, wasn't immediate. Dr. Warren insisted they remain at Fort Laramie for at least a week to ensure the baby regained her strength and to guard against a relapse. The Army commander, a kindly colonel who had daughters of his own, arranged for Victoria to stay in the officers' quarters rather than the infirmary once Emily was well enough to be moved. Daniel, to Victoria's surprise, delayed his return to Promise Creek. "Town's got a deputy who can handle things for a spell," he explained when she questioned him. "And I've got business at the fort anyway." Victoria suspected this business was largely invented, but she was too grateful for his continued presence to challenge him. In the 5 days since their arrival, Daniel had become a steadying influence for both her and Emily. The baby, especially, seemed drawn to him, quieting immediately whenever he spoke or held her. "She's smitten with you," Victoria observed on their 6th day at the fort, watching as Daniel walked Emily around the small sitting room attached to their temporary quarters. The baby was alert and active, showing no signs of her recent illness beyond a lingering tendency to tire easily. Daniel smiled down at Emily, who was contentedly gumming the wooden star he'd carved for her. "Smart girl, takes after her mother." The compliment brought color to Victoria's cheeks. These past days had seen a gradual shift in their relationship, from desperate strangers to something approaching friendship. Daniel had shared meals with them, helped with Emily, and spent long evenings in conversation that ranged from childhood memories to favorite books to dreams deferred. Victoria found herself increasingly drawn to his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness with Emily, and the intelligence that belied his frontier lawman exterior. Daniel was educated. He'd attended 2 years of college before the war interrupted, and thoughtful in a way few men she'd known had been. For his part, Daniel seemed genuinely interested in Victoria beyond her role as Emily's mother. He asked about her life before coming west, listened attentively to her stories of teaching school in Pennsylvania, and encouraged her when she hesitantly mentioned her own deferred dream of writing. "Why deferred?" he'd asked when she mentioned it. "Life intervened," Victoria had answered simply. "Marriage, homesteading, Emily, there hasn't been time." "There's still time," Daniel had pointed out. "You're what, 25, 24, she'd corrected, surprised he'd guessed so close. Plenty of time for new beginnings then. New beginnings. The phrase had lingered in Victoria's mind as Emily recovered and her own strength returned. What form would those beginnings take? The question remained unanswered as their time at Fort Laramie drew to a close. On the morning of their 7th day, Dr. Warren pronounced Emily fully recovered. "She's a remarkably resilient child," he told Victoria during his final examination. "Keep her warm as the weather turns, watch for any return of the cough, but otherwise she can resume normal activities." "Thank you," Victoria said, her gratitude extending far beyond the simple words. "For everything you've done." Dr. Warren smiled, tickling Emily under the chin to make her laugh. "It's been a pleasure watching this little one recover. Where will you go now?" The question Victoria had been avoiding could no longer be postponed. "Back to Promise Creek," she said after a moment. "Sheriff McAllister has offered to take us." What she didn't say was that she had no idea what awaited her there. The homestead was 15 miles from town, too far to walk regularly, especially as winter approached. Without a working wagon or horse, she would be as isolated as before. And the cabin itself held more painful memories than happy ones, especially since Thomas's death. Dr. Warren nodded, seeming to understand the uncertainty behind her words. "If you're ever back this way, bring her in for a checkup. I'd like to see how she progresses." After he left, Victoria began packing their few belongings. Daniel had procured a carpet bag for her from the fort's general store, replacing the tattered sack she'd carried from the homestead. As she folded Emily's clean gowns, also provided by the fort's generous residents, Victoria tried to focus on the immediate journey rather than the nebulous future. Daniel arrived as she was finishing. Emily balanced on his hip as naturally as if he'd been carrying babies for years. "Wagon's ready whenever you are," he said, bouncing Emily gently when she began to fuss. "Weather looks clear for the ride back," Victoria nodded, securing the carpetbag's clasp. "We're ready." Daniel studied her face for a moment. "Are you sure about this, going back to the homestead?" Victoria looked up in surprise. Had her doubts been so transparent? "I don't have many options," she said carefully. "You have more than you might think." Daniel sat in the room's single chair, settling Emily on his knee. "Victoria, I've been thinking about your situation." Something in his tone made Victoria's heart beat faster. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap to hide their sudden trembling. "Promise Creek needs a schoolteacher," Daniel continued. "The last one left 2 months ago, married a cattle buyer and moved to Denver. The town council's been looking for a replacement." Victoria stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he seemed to be suggesting. "I haven't taught in nearly 3 years. But you could again. You said yourself you enjoyed it." "There's Emily to consider," Victoria pointed out. "I can't teach and care for her at the same time," Daniel smiled. "Mrs. Hollister, she runs the boarding house, has been looking after the Miller twins since their mother died last year. She'd be happy to watch Emily during school hours." The thought was tempting, so tempting that Victoria was almost afraid to consider it. To teach again, to use her education, to be part of a community rather than isolated in a failing homestead. "The pay's not much," Daniel continued, "but the town provides housing for the teacher, a small cottage behind the schoolhouse. It's nothing fancy, but it's weather-tight and has a proper stove. You've given this a lot of thought, Victoria observed, her voice not quite steady. Daniel's eyes met hers, serious and intent. I have. Victoria, I've seen what you're capable of, the strength it took to carry Emily all that way, the devotion you've shown through her illness. Promise Creek would be lucky to have you. And what about the homestead, Thomas's dream? Daniel's expression softened. Dreams can change, sometimes they have to. The simple truth of his words struck Victoria deeply. Thomas's dream of a prosperous cattle ranch had been born of a young man's optimism, untempered by experience. The reality, poor soil, harsh winters, isolation had proven far different from the vision that had brought them west. I'd have to sell the homestead, Victoria said slowly, thinking aloud, though I doubt anyone would buy it. Actually, Daniel said, Abe Foster's been looking to expand his grazing land. Your section adjoins his northern pasture. He mentioned just before we left that he might be interested if you ever decided to sell. Victoria gave a startled laugh. You really have thought of everything. Daniel looked slightly abashed. I just want you to know you have choices. Whatever you decide, I'll support. The sincerity in his voice touched something long dormant in Victoria's heart. Since Thomas's death, perhaps even before she had felt adrift, following a path laid out by circumstances rather than choice. Daniel was offering her the chance to chart her own course again. I need time to think, she said finally. It's a big decision, Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course, there's no rush. But as they left Fort Laramie later that day, the wagon considerably more comfortable than it had been on their desperate journey to the fort, Victoria found her mind increasingly drawn to the possibility Daniel had presented. Teaching again, living in town. Being part of a community rather than struggling alone, they made better time on the return journey, stopping overnight at the same creek where they'd rested on the way to the fort. Emily, fully recovered, was alert and curious, babbling happily as she watched the campfire's flames. She seems to love being outdoors, Daniel observed as they sat beside the fire after supper, Emily lying on a blanket between them, reaching for the sparks that rose toward the starry sky. She does, Victoria agreed. Even as a tiny baby, she'd calm immediately if I took her outside. Thomas used to say she was born with wanderlust. Takes after her father in that, then, Victoria smiled, memories of Thomas's restless energy surfacing. Yes, he was always looking toward the horizon, convinced something better waited just beyond it. And you, Daniel asked quietly. What were you looking for when you came west? Victoria considered the question, realizing no one had ever asked her that before. Everyone, including Thomas, had assumed she'd simply followed her husband's dream. I wanted adventure, she admitted. My life in Pennsylvania felt prescribed. Teaching school, attending church socials, eventually marrying a local boy and raising children in the same town where I'd grown up. When Thomas proposed and talked about going west, it sounded like freedom. Was it? Daniel's question held no judgment, only genuine interest. Victoria looked into the fire, weighing honesty against loyalty to Thomas's memory. Sometimes, she said finally. When we first arrived, everything was new and exciting, building the cabin together, planting our first crops, exploring the countryside. But then, reality set in, Daniel finished when she trailed off. Victoria nodded. The work was harder than we'd imagined. The isolation, especially during winter, was crushing. Thomas started talking about moving on, finding somewhere better, but you stayed. We'd invested everything we had in that homestead, and then I was expecting Emily. Victoria stroked her daughter's cheek gently. By the time she was born, leaving didn't seem possible anymore. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching Emily's eyelids grow heavy as sleep overtook her. And now? He finally asked. Victoria met his gaze across the fire. Now I'm thinking that perhaps staying is what's no longer possible. Something like hope flickered in Daniel's eyes, quickly masked. He nodded once, accepting her words without pressing for more. They reached Promise Creek the following afternoon. The small town looked different to Victoria now, less a last desperate hope and more a potential beginning. As they rode down the main street, several townspeople called greetings to Daniel, their curious gazes lingering on Victoria and Emily. "Where would you like me to take you?" Daniel asked as they passed the sheriff's office. "To the homestead, or—" The moment of decision had arrived sooner than Victoria had expected. She looked down at Emily, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then at the dusty street with its modest buildings, the general store, the saloon, the small church at the far end. Somewhere behind the schoolhouse was a cottage that could be theirs. "Could we see the teacher's cottage?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just to look." Daniel's smile was worth the momentary uncertainty. "Of course." He guided the wagon past the main street to where a small white schoolhouse stood on a gentle rise. Behind it, partially sheltered by two large cottonwood trees, was a modest cottage with a small porch and neatly shuttered windows. Daniel helped Victoria down from the wagon, Emily still sleeping in her arms, and led the way to the cottage door. He produced a key from his pocket, further evidence of his planning, and opened the door, stepping aside to let Victoria enter first. The interior was simple but charming. A central room served as both parlor and kitchen, with a cast-iron stove in one corner and built-in shelves along one wall. Two doors led off the main room, one to a small bedroom, the other to an even smaller room that might serve as Emily's nursery. "It's been empty since Miss Harrington left," Daniel explained as Victoria explored. "The town council had it cleaned last week, thinking a new teacher might arrive on the next stage coach." Victoria ran her hand along the smooth surface of a small table by the window. "It's lovely," she said softly. "Much nicer than I expected." "The last 3 teachers have added their own touches," Daniel said. "The shelves were Miss Harrington's contribution. Her father built them." Victoria crossed to the shelves, noting how they would perfectly hold the few books she'd managed to bring West, her Bible, a volume of Shakespeare's plays, Jane Eyre, and the journal where she occasionally scribbled stories when time and energy permitted. "The school itself is well maintained," Daniel continued. "About 20 students ages 6 to 16. They're good children mostly, a bit wild but eager to learn." Victoria turned to face him, Emily beginning to stir in her arms. "You really want me to stay?" she observed, wonder in her voice. Daniel met her gaze steadily. "I do. Promise Creek needs a teacher, and yes, I want you to stay." The simple honesty of his statement stirred something deep within Victoria, something she had thought died with Thomas. The possibility of beginning again, not just as a teacher or as Emily's mother, but as a woman with her own desires and hopes. "I need to see the homestead first," she said. "To be certain," Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We can go tomorrow if you'd like. For tonight, Mrs. Hollister has prepared a room for you and Emily at the boarding house." The boarding house proved to be a well-kept 2-story building near the center of town. Mrs. Hollister, a plump, energetic widow in her 50s, welcomed Victoria and Emily with genuine warmth. "Sheriff McAllister told us all about your ordeal," she said, leading Victoria to a comfortable room on the 2nd floor. "So brave of you, my dear, carrying your little one all that way, and how fortunate that Daniel found you when he did." Victoria murmured agreement, though privately she suspected luck had little to do with it. Something larger seemed to be at work, the same providence that had guided her steps toward Promise Creek in her hour of need, after settling Emily in the small crib Mrs. Hollister provided. Victoria joined the boarding house residents for dinner in the communal dining room. The meal was simple but nourishing, and the company welcoming. Several townspeople had been invited specifically to meet her, including members of the town council who, she realized midway through the meal, were evaluating her suitability as their new teacher. "Miss Harrington did a fine job, but she wasn't cut out for frontier life," explained Mr. Peterson, the dry goods merchant who served as council president. "We need someone with more resilience." "Carrying a sick baby 15 miles on foot shows plenty of resilience," Daniel commented from his place at the far end of the table. Victoria felt a rush of gratitude for his support. Throughout the meal, he had remained a steady presence, occasionally steering the conversation when it veered too close to painful topics. ensuring she wasn't overwhelmed by the council's thinly disguised interrogation. By the time dinner ended, Victoria sensed the council members were favorably impressed. Mr. Peterson invited her to inspect the schoolhouse the following afternoon, after you've had a chance to rest and consider our offer. Later, as Victoria prepared for bed in the quiet of her room, she found her thoughts turning repeatedly to Daniel. His kindness extended far beyond his duty as sheriff. The teaching position, the arrangements at the boarding house, even the potential buyer for the homestead all spoke of a man who had considered her welfare with unexpected thoroughness. Was it merely kindness that motivated him? Victoria allowed herself to consider for the first time that Daniel's interest might be personal as well as practical. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Thomas had been gone less than a year. Was she ready to contemplate another attachment so soon? Emily stirred in her crib, distracting Victoria from her unsettling thoughts. As she soothed her daughter back to sleep, Victoria resolved to focus on the immediate decisions before her: the homestead, the teaching position, a new life in Promise Creek. These were practical matters that needed resolution before she could consider more personal possibilities. Morning brought bright sunshine and a renewed sense of purpose. After breakfast, Daniel arrived with a borrowed horse and buggy to take Victoria to the homestead. "Thought this might be easier than the wagon," he explained, helping her and Emily into the seat. The journey to the homestead took just over an hour, much quicker than Victoria's desperate walk into town with Emily. As they approached the familiar ridge that overlooked the small valley where the cabin stood, Victoria felt a curious mix of emotions: nostalgia, sadness, but also a strange sense of detachment, as if she were visiting a place from a half-forgotten dream. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, its log walls weathered gray by sun and wind. The small garden she'd planted in spring was overrun with weeds, and the chicken coop stood empty, its door hanging askew on broken hinges. "Would you like to go inside?" Daniel asked softly as the buggy came to a stop before the cabin. Victoria hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I need to." Daniel tied the horse to the hitching post Thomas had erected their first week on the homestead, then helped Victoria down from the buggy. Emily, curious about the new surroundings, reached out to touch the rough logs of the cabin wall as they approached the door. The interior was much as Victoria had left it: the table and chairs Thomas had crafted, the iron bed where Emily had been born, the shelves holding their meager supplies. A fine layer of dust covered everything, and a mouse scurried away as they entered, but otherwise the cabin seemed frozen in time. Victoria moved through the small space, touching familiar objects: Thomas's pipe still on the mantel, her sewing basket beside the rocking chair, the worn quilt on the bed. Each item held memories, some sweet, others painful. But as she completed her circuit of the cabin, Victoria realized something important: this place no longer felt like home. "I thought it would be harder," she said, turning to Daniel, who stood quietly by the door, Emily in his arms. "Coming back, seeing everything again, and it's not." He asked, watching her carefully. Victoria shook her head. "It's like visiting someone else's life, a life that's finished." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes the hardest step is realizing you're ready to move forward." Victoria took a last look around the cabin, the place where she'd been both happier and more miserable than she'd ever been. Where she'd become a mother. Where she'd learned her own strength in the long months after Thomas's death. "I'm ready," she said simply. They spent an hour gathering the personal items Victoria wanted to keep: photographs, letters, a few pieces of jewelry, Thomas's Bible, Emily's christening gown. Everything else, she decided, could remain with the homestead when it was sold. "I'll speak to Abe Foster this afternoon," Daniel promised as they loaded the last of Victoria's belongings into the buggy. "If he's still interested, we can draw up the papers this week." As they drove away from the cabin, Victoria resisted the urge to look back. Instead, she focused on Emily, happily playing with the wooden star Daniel had carved for her, and on the road ahead that led back to Promise Creek, to new possibilities and perhaps a second chance at happiness. The town council officially offered Victoria the teaching position that afternoon, following her tour of the schoolhouse. The building was well maintained, with rows of sturdy desks, a small library of textbooks, and large windows that filled the single room with light. "Classes begin the first Monday of October," Mr. Peterson informed her as they stood in the schoolyard. "That gives you 2 weeks to prepare. The previous curriculum notes are in the desk drawer, though of course you're free to make changes as you see fit." Victoria accepted the position with a gratitude that went beyond words. Within days, her life had transformed from one of isolation and struggle to one of purpose and community. The sale of the homestead to Abe Foster, finalized more quickly than she dared hope, provided enough money to purchase necessities for their new home and set a small sum aside for emergencies. Moving into the teacher's cottage became a community effort. Mrs. Hollister contributed curtains and linens. Mr. Peterson provided a credit at his store for household items. Several families whose children would be Victoria's students brought gifts of preserves, baked goods, or simple furniture. And Daniel was there through it all, helping to move her few belongings from the homestead, installing shelves in Emily's small room, repairing the cottage's back steps that had begun to rot. His presence became a constant in Victoria's new life, as natural and necessary as breath. On the Sunday before classes were to begin, Victoria invited Daniel to dinner at the cottage, her first attempt at entertaining in her new home. She prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew and biscuits, with apple pie from Mrs. Hollister's kitchen for dessert. As they sat across from each other at the small table, Emily already asleep in her crib in the next room, Victoria was struck by how right it felt, this quiet domesticity, the companionable conversation. The way Daniel's presence filled the cottage with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire in the stove. "Nervous about tomorrow?" Daniel asked as they lingered over coffee after the meal. Victoria smiled. "A little. It's been a while since I stood before a classroom." "You'll be wonderful," Daniel said with a conviction that bolstered her confidence. "Those children are fortunate to have you." Victoria studied him across the table, noting the way the lamplight caught the silver threads beginning to appear at his temples, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. In the 3 weeks since their desperate journey to Fort Laramie, Daniel had become more than her rescuer, more than a friend. He had become someone essential to her happiness. "Daniel," she began, her heart beating faster, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." His expression grew serious, attentive. "What is it?" Victoria gathered her courage. "Why did you help us that day? You could have simply directed me to the doctor's office. Instead, you undertook a dangerous journey with strangers." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "When I saw you walking into town carrying Emily, I recognized something in you, a determination, a courage that reminded me of my sister after her husband died. She raised 5 children alone, never complained, never gave up." He paused, his gaze dropping to his coffee cup. "But she didn't have to do it completely alone. She had family, neighbors. When I saw you, I thought no one should have to face that kind of struggle without help." "That explains why you helped us get to Fort Laramie," Victoria said softly, "but not why you've done so much since then." The teaching position, the cottage, helping with the homestead sale. Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Do you really not know?" The simple question hung between them, laden with meaning. Victoria felt a flutter of anticipation, of hope. "Perhaps I do," she whispered. "But I'd like to hear you say it." Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Victoria, from the moment I saw you carrying Emily into town, I admired your courage. During our journey to Fort Laramie, that admiration grew into something deeper. Watching you fight for your daughter's life, seeing your strength and grace under the most difficult circumstances, how could I not fall in love with you?" The words, spoken so simply and directly, filled Victoria with a joy she had thought never to feel again. Yet alongside that joy was uncertainty. "It's been less than a year since Thomas died," she said, not withdrawing her hand but needing to voice her concern. "I'm not sure if I'm ready, I know," Daniel interrupted gently. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, I just wanted you to know how I feel. The rest, whatever happens between us, can unfold in its own time. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at his understanding. Thomas was a good man, she said. He loved Emily, dreamed of giving us a better life, but our marriage wasn't. It wasn't what I'd hoped for. Daniel squeezed her hand. You don't have to explain. I want to, Victoria insisted, because you deserve to know that what I feel for you, it's different, stronger, more real somehow. A look of wonder crossed Daniel's face. You feel something for me then? Victoria smiled through her tears. How could I not? You saved my daughter's life. You gave us a future when we had none. And beyond that, you saw me, Daniel, not just as Emily's mother or Thomas's widow, but as myself. Daniel rose from his chair and came around the table, kneeling beside her. Victoria, I don't want to rush you, we have time. But I want you to know that I see a future with you and Emily. A life we could build together, here in Promise Creek. Victoria looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the depth of feeling. Something within her, a last lingering doubt perhaps, or a final allegiance to a past that was truly finished, released its hold. I'd like that, she whispered, lifting a hand to touch his cheek. Very much. Daniel's smile was like sunrise breaking across the prairie. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, he leaned forward and kissed her. The gentle press of his lips against hers held promise rather than demand, affection rather than passion. It was a beginning, not an ending, the first step on a new journey they would take together. When he drew back, Victoria saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. We'll take it slow, he promised. One day at a time. One day at a time, Victoria agreed, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together just as they had that desperate night on the road to Fort Laramie when a sheriff with kind eyes had promised a frightened mother, "We'll find a doctor together." And they had. They had found not only a doctor, but also a future neither could have imagined when Victoria carried her sick baby into Promise Creek that fateful summer evening. The first day of school arrived with bright autumn sunshine and a crisp breeze that hinted at the approaching winter. Victoria stood at the schoolhouse door, welcoming each student with a smile, learning names and faces that would soon become familiar. Emily, content in Mrs. Hollister's capable arms, waved from the porch of the nearby boarding house. As the last student filed in and Victoria prepared to close the door, she caught sight of Daniel across the schoolyard, leaning against the hitching post. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture of support and affection that warmed her more than the morning sun. Victoria smiled, returning the gesture with a small wave before closing the door to begin her first lesson. Outside, life in Promise Creek continued its steady rhythm. Inside, 20 eager faces looked to their new teacher for guidance. Victoria took a deep breath and began. Good morning, children. I'm Miss Caldwell, and I'm very pleased to meet each of you. As she spoke, Victoria felt a profound sense of rightness, of belonging. This was where she was meant to be, not in an isolated cabin pursuing someone else's dream, but here, in this community, using her gifts and building a new life for herself and Emily. And Daniel McAllister, the sheriff who had promised to help find a doctor when all seemed lost, would be part of that life, a partner, a friend, and in time, perhaps something more. The future stretched before them, full of possibility. One day at a time, Victoria reminded herself as she opened the first lesson. One day at a time, the weeks that followed established a pleasant rhythm to Victoria's new life in Promise Creek. Mornings were devoted to teaching, afternoons to planning lessons and caring for Emily, evenings to quiet domesticity in the small cottage that increasingly felt like home. Daniel visited regularly, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to bring a book he thought she might enjoy or to spend time with Emily, who had developed a devoted attachment to him. As October gave way to November, their relationship deepened gradually, naturally. Daniel was true to his word about taking things slowly, never pressuring Victoria for more than she was ready to give. Their moments together were comfortable, filled with conversation and laughter, punctuated by increasingly tender gestures, a touch of hands. A kiss goodbye, the warm embrace that had become their customary greeting. On Thanksgiving, Victoria and Emily joined Daniel for dinner at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, where the widow hosted a feast for those in town without family nearby. Seated beside Daniel at the long table, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, Victoria felt a surge of gratitude for how dramatically her life had changed in just a few months. Happy? Daniel asked quietly, noticing her thoughtful expression. Victoria smiled, watching Emily charm the elderly Mr. Simmons across the table. Very. I was just thinking about where Emily and I might be if you hadn't helped us that day. Daniel's hand found hers beneath the table. Best not to dwell on what might have been. I prefer to focus on what is and what could be. The warmth in his eyes as he spoke made Victoria's heart beat faster. Though neither had spoken of love since that evening in her cottage, it was there in every interaction, growing stronger with each passing day. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Promise Creek in snow by the first week of December. School continued despite the weather, the schoolhouse kept warm by a roaring fire in the large stove. Daniel took to escorting Victoria and Emily home each afternoon, concerned about the increasingly treacherous path between the schoolhouse and their cottage. I can manage, you know, Victoria told him one blustery afternoon as they trudged through fresh fallen snow, Emily bundled in Daniel's arms. We made it through last winter alone on the homestead. I know you can manage, Daniel replied, adjusting Emily's woolen cap. That doesn't mean you should have to. The simple statement encapsulated much of what Victoria had come to love about Daniel, his respect for her independence coupled with his desire to support her. Unlike Thomas, whose protection had often felt like control, Daniel offered assistance without diminishing her capability. As Christmas approached, Victoria found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. She wanted to give Daniel a gift that would express her deepening feelings, yet nothing seemed adequate. Material presents, a new shirt, gloves, a book, felt insufficient for the man who had given her and Emily so much. The answer came one evening as she sat by the fire in her cottage, watching Daniel read to Emily from a tattered copy of The Night Before Christmas. The baby was nearly asleep in his arms, her eyelids drooping as Daniel's deep voice recited the familiar verses. The scene, domestic, tender, filled with quiet joy, crystallized Victoria's feelings beyond any remaining doubt. She loved this man. Not with the infatuated enthusiasm she'd felt for Thomas, but with a deeper, steadier emotion born of shared experiences, mutual respect, and genuine affection. More importantly, she was ready to build a future with him, ready to take the step they'd both been circling for months. On Christmas Eve, after a beautiful service at Promise Creek's small church, Daniel walked Victoria and Emily home through gently falling snow. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above them, the entire town transformed into a sparkling wonderland. Would you like to come in? Victoria asked when they reached the cottage. I have something for you. Daniel smiled, brushing snow from his hat. I have something for you and Emily too. Inside, Victoria put a sleepy Emily to bed while Daniel built up the fire. When she returned to the main room, she found him standing by the mantel, examining the small collection of treasures she'd arranged there, a pine cone Emily had been fascinated by, the wooden star he'd carved during their time at Fort Laramie, a photograph of Thomas that Victoria kept out of respect for his place in Emily's life. She's asleep, he asked, turning at Victoria's approach. The moment her head touched the pillow, Victoria confirmed. All the excitement of her first Christmas, I suppose, Daniel smiled. She's growing so quickly, seems like yesterday she was that tiny bundle you carried into town. She'll be walking before we know it, Victoria agreed. Dr. Warren said she's advanced for her age. Takes after her mother, Daniel said, his expression warm with affection. Victoria moved to the small table where she'd placed Daniel's gift, a simply wrapped package tied with red ribbon. I wanted to give you this tonight, she said, suddenly nervous. It's not much, but I'm sure it's perfect, Daniel interrupted, accepting the package with a smile. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal. Opening it, he found the first few pages filled with Victoria's neat handwriting. "It's the beginning of a story," she explained as he read the first lines. "About a brave sheriff who helps a desperate mother find a doctor for her sick baby." Daniel looked up, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You're writing again," Victoria nodded. Because you reminded me that dreams don't have to be deferred forever." "Victoria," Daniel began, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "The rest of the journal is empty," she continued, "because the story isn't finished yet. In fact, I'm hoping it's just beginning." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. "Victoria, are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you," Victoria said simply. "I'm saying I'm ready for whatever comes next for us to write the rest of our story together." Daniel's smile was like sunrise breaking across the prairie. He set the journal carefully on the table, then reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "I was going to wait until tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but it seems Christmas has come early." He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm, a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained, holding the ring between them. "Victoria, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I love you. I love Emily as if she were my own. I want to build a life with you both if you'll have me." Tears filled Victoria's eyes as she looked at the ring at the promise it represented, not an end to her independence, but a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Daniel." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears of joy. "Merry Christmas, Victoria," Daniel murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "Merry Christmas, Daniel," she replied, marveling at how far they'd come from that desperate summer evening when she'd carried her sick baby into town and a kind-eyed sheriff had promised, "We'll find a doctor together." They had found so much more than a doctor. They had found a future, a family, a love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, Victoria and Daniel were married on a bright spring day in April of 1879, with Emily, now a sturdy toddler, serving as their only attendant. The entire town of Promise Creek turned out for the celebration, filling the small church and spilling into the yard outside. Dr. Warren made the journey from Fort Laramie to attend, bringing news that he'd been reassigned to a new post in Denver. "I'll rest easier knowing Emily has both of you looking after her now," he told Victoria and Daniel at the reception held in the schoolyard. "She's a special child." Victoria, radiant in a simple cream gown, looked across to where Daniel was showing Emily a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower. "We're the fortunate ones," she said softly. "Every day with her is a gift." The doctor smiled, following her gaze. "You found a good man in Sheriff McAllister. Not every lawman would have done what he did that night." "I know," Victoria agreed. "Believe me, I know." Their honeymoon was a simple affair, 3 days at a small hotel in Cheyenne while Mrs. Hollister cared for Emily. Upon their return, they settled into Daniel's house, a modest but comfortable dwelling near the sheriff's office that had plenty of room for their small family. Life developed a pleasant rhythm. Victoria continued teaching, with Emily often accompanying her to school now that she was older. Daniel's duties as sheriff kept him busy, but rarely took him far from town. Evenings were spent together as a family, with Daniel teaching Emily her letters or Victoria reading aloud while Daniel whittled toys for the growing collection that filled Emily's room. By the autumn of 1879, there was news to celebrate. Victoria was expecting their first child together. The announcement was met with joy throughout Promise Creek, where Victoria and Daniel had become beloved fixtures of the community. "A brother or sister for me?" Emily asked when they explained the news to her, her blue eyes wide with wonder. "Yes, sweetheart," Victoria confirmed, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm. "The baby will arrive in the spring." "I hope it's a sister," Emily declared with the authority of a 2.5-year-old. "Boys are too noisy," Daniel laughed, swinging Emily up onto his shoulders. "You might be right about that, little miss. But whether it's a brother or sister, you'll be the best big sister any baby could have." As Victoria watched them together, Daniel with the child who had become his daughter in every way that mattered, Emily secure in the love of the man she now called Papa, she felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Their son, James Thomas McAllister, was born on a stormy night in April 1880. The labor was difficult, but with Daniel by her side and the steady guidance of Mrs. Foster, the local midwife, Victoria emerged tired but triumphant. "He looks like you," Daniel said in wonder, cradling his newborn son while Emily peered curiously at her brother from her perch on the edge of the bed. Victoria smiled tiredly. "He has your chin, and I think his eyes will be blue like yours." "He's very red," Emily observed critically. "And wrinkly," Daniel chuckled. "All babies start out that way, remember? You were just the same." Emily looked doubtful but reached out a careful finger to touch her brother's tiny hand. When James reflexively grasped her finger, her expression transformed to one of awe. "He likes me," she whispered. "Of course he does," Victoria assured her. "You're his big sister." As she watched her family, Daniel gazing adoringly at their son, Emily protective and fascinated by her new brother, Victoria felt her heart might burst with happiness. This was what she had found in Promise Creek. Not just safety or security, but a true home, a family bound by love rather than mere circumstance. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. A second son, Michael, joined the family in 1882, followed by a daughter, Catherine, in 1885. The town of Promise Creek grew alongside the McAllister family, with a railroad spur bringing increased prosperity and new residents. Victoria eventually retired from teaching to focus on raising their children, though she never abandoned her writing. By 1890, she had published several stories in Eastern magazines, tales of frontier life that drew on her experiences while transforming them through her imagination. Daniel continued as sheriff until 1888, when he was elected mayor of Promise Creek. The transition from lawman to civic leader suited him, allowing him to contribute to the town's development while keeping him close to home and family. Emily, who had inherited both Victoria's intelligence and Daniel's steady determination, attended the newly established Women's College in Cheyenne, returning to Promise Creek as the town's first female doctor in 1898, a development that brought Dr. Warren, now retired in Denver, back for a proud visit. Through it all, the busy days of raising 4 children, the challenges of life in a growing frontier town, the personal and professional accomplishments that marked their years together, Daniel and Victoria remained devoted to each other and to the family they had built. On summer evenings, they often sat together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard, or, in later years, simply enjoying the quiet companionship they'd established over decades of marriage. "You ever think about that night?" Daniel asked once as they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a quiet evening at home. "When you walked into town carrying Emily," Victoria considered the question, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Sometimes, it was the worst day of my life and the best." Daniel nodded, understanding. "It's strange how life works. If Emily hadn't fallen ill, if you hadn't been desperate enough to walk all that way. If you hadn't been standing outside your office at that exact moment," Victoria continued, "we might never have found each other," Daniel finished. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, grateful beyond words for the life they'd built together. "I'm glad we did." Daniel pressed a kiss to her temple, his love for her as strong after 25 years as it had been that Christmas Eve when he'd placed his mother's ring on her finger. "So am I, Victoria, so am I." In the yard before them, their youngest grandchild, Emily's daughter, named Victoria after her grandmother, chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, her laughter a testament to the legacy of love that had begun on a desperate summer evening in 1878, when a brave young mother had carried her sick baby into town and a kind-eyed sheriff had promised, "We'll find a doctor together." They had found so much more,